In thinking about identity, the reason it's important to me is I think I've changed my thinking about it in such a profound way, and that it's really made a tremendous difference in what I can offer to people and what I think the world is really dealing with. When I think back about identity, I think to the kids that I used to work with in schools. I was a school social worker, dealt with kids from kindergarten all the way through to high school. And I traveled around to a number of different schools and, got to see a lot of the issues that children deal with as they grow and evolve. And that gave me a real insight into the whole dynamic of identity. But in those days, we weren't talking about identity. No one was really even using that term. I think it was almost like we thought identity wasn't formed for children, certainly not while they were in school, and that it was somewhat sacred, I think, that you didn't really want to go messing around with someone's identity. So it was certainly off limits in the work that I did. The closest we came to really in looking at identity was the whole idea of self-esteem. And I did get a lot of parents coming to me wanting to know how to help their children have more self-esteem, higher self-esteem. And truthfully, that was a pretty challenging question for me because there wasn't a simple answer. It wasn't easy, and in a way we didn't really know what created high self-esteem, because there were children that you might have thought wouldn't have high self-esteem that seemed to feel pretty good about themselves, and then there were others that you would have thought they should have great self-esteem, and they didn't. So it was all pretty mysterious. The whole identity, of identity really came to the fore for me with Dr. William Glasser. I think he was really a pioneer because he started talking about the idea of success and failure identity. And he was primarily talking about adults, but what he'd seen is when adults are involved with any kind of addiction, he recognized that their world narrowed and that they really seemed to lock into what he called a failure identity and a downward spiral. And conversely, people could have a success identity. Well, I think Dr. Glasser was right on the money with that one, that really he was pointing to there's something very important we need to look at in terms of the big picture of how we hold ourselves and what our identity really is. Unfortunately, I think his primary focus was on behavior. And so even though he was talking about identity, he really was looking at what people were doing. And I think the real key to identity is far beyond the behavior. We need to look beyond that. So I started to work as a private practitioner with a lot of trauma and abuse. And I saw people very much attached to an identity that was based on the trauma that they'd experienced. It was like they'd built their whole identity around the pain, the trauma, the impact that those experiences had had, and of course the beliefs that they'd formed about themselves and about the world. And as I tried to help them shift that identity, it didn't go over well. I noticed a lot of resistance. People even, I would say, defended that identity. They were attached to it. And that got me thinking about how early does our identity form? And in fact, how does it solidify? And as I looked at kids, I thought back to the kids that I worked with, and I could really see, in retrospect, the children that I was successful with were ones that had a pretty good identity. They needed help with certain kinds of issues and behaviors, maybe a challenge that had come up in their life, but we worked pretty successfully at that level. The children I was not successful with in the way that I was hoping were kids that were really struggling with their identity, because I didn't have tools in those days to really help them make a shift at the identity level. Well, I think what changed for me as I looked and worked with people with trauma and I saw how hard it was to shift identity, I really started thinking about what would it take to make that kind of shift. And then I had a shift in my life. My husband and I separated. It was a very, very challenging thing for me. It was one of those things people call the dark night of the soul. And it really showed me how my identity as well had been based on externals, on who I was as a professional, as a wife, as a mother, and so on. And when something challenges that, like a separation or an illness or a loss of a job, it can be catastrophic. And suddenly the identity that you think you have isn't as solid, and it can start to crumble. That really took me into a very important journey within myself and resulted in me figuring out that the constructed identity, as I call it, the one we've built up from childhood, is really never going to be solid for us. It can always be influenced, rocked, challenged by life. So what's the alternative? What do we do instead? How do we step out of an identity that's not serving us? Those were the questions I was wrestling with for myself as well as for clients. And the answer was wonderful. The answer really came when I realized that nothing outside myself was ever going to give me the safety, the well-being, the peace that I was looking for. It was all going to have to come from somewhere else, not based on accomplishments, on money, on recognition. None of that stuff was going to do it. What I really was looking for is an identity that was based on the inside of me feeling safe, whole, having a sense of well-being and peace. That was what I was personally searching for and what I really believe my clients were looking for. And today we know so much more about that. Today in my work with Prime Potential, I literally help people step out of a constructed identity into a place and a foundation where they do feel whole and secure and a sense of peace within themselves. And that is all about us being in the present. Eckhart Tolle, who's talked a lot about the ability to be present, is really talking about our capacity to be connected with who we truly are, which is unchanging. Our core essence, our true identity, does not change. It is an ever-going, ongoing presence that if we can connect with that, then we can have a real sense of safety and security and of peace and well-being. So that's the work I'm doing now that I think is so exciting. And I wanted to include this piece on identity early in this blog series because I think if we really start to think about this, we can see with children how important it is to really help them not build their identity just around what they do, what they know, who they have for friends, but really encourage them to find that sense of identity in terms of who they truly are in the inside, that core being. I like to think of the world as one in which we help children grow up knowing who they are and how special they are and how amazing they are just for who they are. That's the world that I really want to contribute to and to help create.